All right, good people. I hope that we're all doing well and staying inside and not eating too many snacks. But we're going to talk about family today. And so, what I want to talk about is, and I want us to think about what is the typical American household? What does the typical American household look like? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to think about that. What does that look like? This is actually what our typical American household looks like. How many of us were right? Most often when we start talking about the typical American family, most people think two parents, male, female, both working, well, male at home, male working, woman at home, two dependent children, right? Almost looks like The Simpsons, right? However, if we look at our history just over the past since 1970, we see that that has never been the case, right? And I keep saying I'm going to go back to 1950 because I think that's where this idea comes from. Nevertheless, what we see is just that over the past few years, that hasn't been the case. What we've actually seen is an increase in non-family households. That means people who are living together and not related at all, which is an interesting kind of phenomenon. So what we're going to do today is family as a social group, the family as a social system, and the family as a social institution. And we read earlier in our textbook this whole idea of what a social group is. It is a collection of people who recognize one another. And we're talking about as family, right? There are two kinds of groups, and we'll talk about that when we talk about how the family fits within that image. Also, we talked about the family as a social system where we have these many interdependent parts. Remember, we talked about the apple orchard before. Everybody's off doing something different. But in order for our world to move forward, we need each other in order to move forward. And then we're going to talk about the family as a social institution where it is organized to meet certain societal. So as a social group, there are two types of groups, primary groups and secondary groups for our society. I love these new effects. So when we're thinking about the family as a social system, so we talked about it as a primary group, as a social system, remember we're talking about these interdependent parts, right? So there are people who are in these family groups, and there are certain things that they do, right? So we're thinking about as a social system, how does that family function? How is it organized? As a social system, our families fulfill very selective tasks for our society. There's a very important role for our families to play. Families also consider these interrelated statuses and roles, right? So I talked about this before. Apple orchard. I should only have to say apple orchard, and y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. Interrelated statuses and roles. We have people who grow the apples. We have people who ship the apples. We have people who buy the apples, right? Families the same way. We have somebody in the family who is responsible for different functions that the family needs to perform. But I'm trying to limit these to 15 minutes. So you can always go back and listen again. Then finally, the family as a social institution, what we find is that the family is the most basic institution. And institutions are those uh, organizations in our society that attempt to organize our culture. Because what happens in institutions is that we are teaching culture. We are teaching people how they're supposed to behave. The interesting piece about this is that all of these institutions are interconnected, and the culture and the rules and regulations or the expectations that are being taught in each of those institutions is reinforced in other institutions. So as an institution, it's a system that organizes human behavior. It's a system of norms, values, statuses, and roles, right? All of that is culture. We learned that a long time ago, right? So what is culture? Culture is shared beliefs. What are these shared beliefs? Norms, values, statuses, roles. All of that stuff is taught within our families. The mythical family. Now, this goes back to the thing I had you think about at the very beginning of the lecture, where I asked you, what does our family look like? And in many cases, what we come up with this image of what it looks like, but not only do we have this kind of physical image, but we have these expectations of what family do, right? And in many cases, when we call it a myth, that means it's not true, right? So historically, and even more contemporarily, we're thinking about the family as being this harmonious place where people get along. When people talk about family, your family is your bond. Your family is really so important because it's harmonious. It's the place where everybody kind of gets along with each other. This is a myth, right? It's a haven in the heartless world. It's a place where you can go and get rest, where you can go and be rejuvenated. There's also this assumption that we only have one family form. So, again, think back to when I asked you to imagine in your mind what our families look like. Most of us, although I don't know that we would admit it, have this one image of what the family looks like. But what we cannot deny is that single women who have children are a family. We're having this conversation within our society historically about can same sex people be considered a family, right? So we're having those conversations and norms are changing, right? The other thing that we assume is that we have an undifferentiated family experience, which means that everybody's family experiences everything the same way. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I had in graduate school, I had a roommate who didn't know how to clean up, and I just thought she was nasty. But it turns out she just didn't know how to clean up, because I assumed that everybody cleaned up on Saturdays, because that's what we did in our household. We got newspapers. We cleaned the windows with newspapers and vinegar and water. Right? We mopped it, swept and mopped the floors. We vacuumed. We cleaned the bathrooms. We did all of that. So we had the experience of what it meant to clean up. She didn't. Right? The other thing that we assume when we talk about this mythical family is that the breakdown of family causes social problems. So think about this. Have you ever heard of a broken family? Right? We've heard of these. These are generally the families that were married, but now they're divorced. They have children. Now they're divorced. They call that the broken family. There's this sense that we have in our society that broken families cause social problems. So because we have single women or single men heading households, this is the cause of a number of problems within our society. Oh, I like that effect. I want to offer just a quick definition of family as a societal arrangement where people related by ancestry, adoption, or marriage live together to form an economic unit and raise children. So it's by a family by birth, adoption, or marriage. So either you're born into it, you can be adopted into it, or you marry into a family. But what is important is that this is a social construction. We make this up. And generally, when we're in class, I would spend some time talking about fictive kin. These are people, and I need y'all to think again. These are people, how many of you have friends, mothers that you call mom, or people you call cousin, and you're not really related to them? That's what we call fictive kin. And in some instances, people say that those fictive kinship relationships are actually tighter or more closer knit than are these family relationships. But that's an interesting conversation for another time. What I also want to share with you is what has happened to our family within capitalism. Because what I need you to know is that families do not exist in a vacuum, right? So what's happening in our larger society is influencing what happens in our families. So historically, if we look at what the kind of common expectation of American families were, it was this idea of men being the breadwinner, where he was off working, and woman being the homemaker because she was staying at home and caring for the children. Now, indeed, there's an entire conversation that you could potentially have about this being an experience that was unique to white middle class folks and not necessarily to the entire society. But again, we got 15 minutes. But what we know is that, and this has been true for all folks, that economic forces produce different family configurations. Now, historically, um, men were able to make enough to support their entire family. So these men who were in middle class were able to make enough money, support the entire family. Women can stay home and take care of the children. However, because the types of jobs are changing, what we see is that the family configurations are changing, even in terms of the number of children you have, and then also who's off working. The argument is that the more resources you have, the more likely you are to conform to nuclear family ideals. And a nuclear family is what we have up here, this man who is the breadwinner who's working, and the woman who's the homemaker who's at home. That, and with the dependent children. That's what we call a nuclear family. Nuclear family is the man working, woman at home. Same thing. The argument is that the more resources you have, the more money you make, the more likely you are to conform to that idea. So if we look at kind of some structural things, and this is right back to this whole idea of capitalism. This our last idea is that as jobs are moving abroad, right? We all know what NAFTA was, the North American Free Trade Agreement. We've talked about that before. We're losing not only blue collar jobs, but we're losing some white collar jobs. For those of us who have cell phones and we call for service, we think we're talking to somebody here. For those of us who own homes and we call for service on our refrigerators or on our stoves, and the people who are offering us resources are indeed not folks who live here. So not only are blue collar jobs, which are these manual labor jobs moving abroad, but so are the white collar jobs. So say all of this to say is that family is this institution in society that operates hand in hand with other institutions in teaching culture. In addition, what's happening in these other institutions, the economy being one, is influencing what happens in our families. All right, good people, take care of y'all. Take care of yourself, and make sure to take the quiz the end of the week.